¿Qué gestiones han hecho ante el foro de los pueblos indígenas en Naciones Unidas después de Katrina?
If anything have you done to appeal to the Forum of Indigenous Peoples through the UN?
Y al mismo tiempo también conocer la posición del Congreso Nacional de los Pueblos Indígenas
Also, what position has been taken by the National Congress of Indigenous Peoples
ante esta situación.
in light of the situation?
You know, I first got here, I became a member of the Ashe Cultural Center, and we had a few human rights meetings there where we were actually approaching the UN for relief help because we weren't getting it from our own people. I don't think that help ever came, so I imagine nothing is being done for anybody here. And now that we're on our second year anniversary, that whole country believes that we're okay here and come on down to the French Quarter, but we're really not. My list of elderly people is getting longer every day. I have people that want to commit suicide. I can't take it any longer, and I'm really tired, and I really want someone to come and help. So if you know any carpenters, send them over.
Yes, Josiah Toro.
Yes, I just have a question.
Please speak into the mic.
You indicated that they passed laws in the absence of the Homa people to build, and I couldn't catch what they built.
They
Flat?
actually asked to build 13 offshore oil rigs, and they were awarded 18. And a few years ago, before the storm hit, when they asked this, the community said no. Now that the community was all displaced, they snuck in there and they passed this judgment to go ahead and build 18, even though they wanted to build only 13. This state produces the most oil for the whole country. I don't understand why we just can't shut everybody down and say, unless you help us fix our country or our state, we're going to stop sending you oil.
Well, yes, Mr. Churchill?
Well, the Homa is still in the land that they have occupied basically since time immemorial. Is this correct?
Yes.
And under U.S. law, you have an interpretation doctrine that assumes title by virtue of a treaty?
I believe so.
Yeah. And yet you tell me the Homa are not recognized by the federal government?
No, I believe they're not.
Then to your knowledge, this may be a question that you can't answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
I'll do my best.
Okay, to your knowledge, what possible treaty relation could the United States be claiming jurisdiction and title over Homa land for purposes of licensing oil rigs or anything else, absent having recognized bilaterally through treaty?
I actually believe that's the reason why the government does not want them to be federally recognized, so they don't become strong enough to say no.
But if the predication to title is in a treaty and they have no treaty, then there's never been a relinquishment of title to the United States.
Right, they're just Louisiana.
So there's a treaty violation inherent here, or a rights violation.
Right.
Thank you.
I would add to that there is also even the state of Louisiana doesn't recover proceeds from the oil revenue. It's a whole special separate district that they've created, fiction that they've created for the oil companies. So.
Tony, as we have been having the witnesses come forth, I have been very interested in the medical aspects that have been given by these various witnesses. This is because in France, there is considerable interest in the medical circles of the medical impact of Katrina, most of the doctors still being on the left, still. I am a bit sorry we don't have a psychiatrist with us. Again, I mourn the passing of Fanon. We can't repeat it often enough. But I would like to ask you, since you mentioned suicide, Do you have in your culture still alive today antidotes, rituals to help this aspect of post-traumatic syndrome?
You know, I've been told now that New Orleans is becoming a very high risk for young people to commit suicide.
Yes.
Rosebud's been the highest for years and no one's done anything about it. So, I mean, wake up. You know, all we could do is put a child in a sweat lodge and teach him how to pray, and hopefully he'll let everything out right there when he's with his community. So it's up to the community to really help each other, because the government's not going to help you. They haven't come to our reservations and helped our children that are killing themselves. They're not going to come here and help yours either. Your town's starting to look like a reservation.
Okay. I don't believe there are any other questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Your Honors, at this time we're going to present our last sector, and that is education, and Damon Hewitt will be presenting.
We get Jim Randalls down, please.
I'm reminded this is the last section for today.
One over there, one here, and one with
Damon Hewitt, this would be
there's a jurist down here. And this gentleman in the white shirt is a jurist. So we can share that one. We can share this one. I suspect it's in English.
Legal Defense and Education Fund, New Orleans, and its education.
While Mr. Hewitt is passing out exhibits for the judges, I would like to ask the audience to please put your cell phones on vibrate or turn them off, please. They are a distraction. Thank you.
5:35.
Oh, I got it. Yeah. Yep. Getting a little blurry, are we? Getting a little blurry, are we? It's feeling a little blurry, are we?
Oh, yes. Okay, it's blurry.
Education is a precondition for the exercise of human rights. The enjoyment of many civil and political human rights, such as the freedom of information and expression, require a minimum level of education, which includes literacy. Similarly, many economic, social, and cultural rights, such as the right to choose work, to receive equal pay for equal work, and to have equal access to public representation, can only be exercised in a meaningful way once a basic education has been achieved. The right to education can be characterized as an empowerment right, which provides the individual with control over his or her life and the power to interact meaningfully in his or her community. Those are not my words, but I thought they were powerful and I wanted to share them. My name is Damon Hewitt. I'm an assistant counsel with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, founded in 1940 by Thurgood Marshall. Good evening, jurists, guests, distinguished colleagues, comrades. Tonight you're going to hear evidence from witnesses, from young people, from parents, from educators themselves, various stakeholders in the lives of young people and in education in the city of New Orleans and in the state of Louisiana. You will hear evidence as to how at all levels of government, local, state, and federal, their rights, their civil and domestic rights, their social and cultural and political rights, and their human rights and their international law rights to education have been violated by the action of these governmental actors. Education has long been deemed a great equalizer. In 1954, our organization obtained a landmark Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education. Many thought at the time we're on our way to equalizing educational opportunity. We're on our way to education being the great equalizer. But for many years, and still to this day, education has been used as a means of domination and control. During the days of slavery in the United States, every southern, and even since then, every southern state since Tennessee has at one time made it illegal to teach enslaved Africans or even free black people how to read and how to write. The story of education for African Americans and poor people and other people of color has been about domination and control. It has been about exclusion. It has been about maintaining social stratification and widening the gaps. Despite that, we have achieved beyond all odds. Some people say that in the black community, they talk about the hip-hop generation, in the black and Latino community in particular, that there's some anti-intellectual strain. They say that black students are afraid to act white. I would say to the contrary. But better yet, our witnesses will say this evening to the contrary. There is no anti-intellectualism that pervades our community. Sure, there are negative influences, but at our heart, we have fought through blood, sweat, and tears for the right to education, for the right to equality. And these witnesses have continued that fight. During the summation, we'll refer to various instruments of international law, and I'll list them right now that bear upon the right to education. Those include the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 26, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 28, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 13, and others as well. But first, I'd like to call our first witness, Mr. Jim Randles, to the stand. You please raise your right hand, sir. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to the best of your ability?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Would you please state and spell your name for the record?
My name is James Randles, J-A-M-E-S-R-A-N-D-E-L-S.
And your occupation, sir?
I'm a teacher in the New Orleans Public Schools.
Okay. And who's your current employer?
I work for two entities, the New Orleans Public Schools. I teach at McMain Secondary School for half of my teaching day. The other half of my teaching day, I work with the Recovery School District operated by the state of Louisiana.
How long have
Frederick Douglass High School.
Thank you, sir. How long have you been teaching?
I've been teaching for about 22 years.
Okay. And all in New Orleans?
All in New Orleans, yes.
Okay. And are you a member of a collective bargaining unit, otherwise known as a union?
I'm a member of a union that had collective bargaining rights my whole teaching career until Katrina hit.
Okay. And what's the name of that union?
United Teachers of New Orleans, American Federation of Teachers, Local 527.
Can you talk about the members of that union?
I can say that before Katrina, approximately upper 80% of teachers were members of that union. I can say that we were the largest group of organized workers in the state of Louisiana. I can say that we were one of two states in the South that have collective bargaining rights for teachers. We were one of three of those groups in the state of Louisiana under the American Federation of Teachers. Since the storm, we've enrolled over about 75% of the members of the New Orleans Public School System now are members, well over 50% in the Recovery School District, and less than that in the charters, around 30%. And I would say that before the storm, you probably had the largest group of black professionals in the city of New Orleans were teachers. The largest group of homeowners in the city of New Orleans who were black were teachers.
Okay. Was there a tradition of biracial or perhaps even multiracial cooperation and organizing in this union?
The organization I'm a member of has a long history, and some of that history is of interracial cooperation, some of it is not. The local I'm a member of was founded in 1937 by black teachers in a struggle to have pay that was equal to white teachers. They won that right in 1947 or 8, I believe, in the McAlpin decision. In 1972, the white teacher organization that was affiliated with the NEA disbanded, and many of the white teachers then became part of AFT Local 527, and from that time forward it's been an interracial organization.
Thank you. Can you share with us the subjects that you taught? What kinds of subjects did you teach, and what issues did you address in your classes?
I'm an English teacher. I teach writing courses. I work with a program called Students to Center. I've taught Black Studies courses in New Orleans. I've taught civics classes. I've taught in gifted programs. And basically we teach students to be able to have a critical analysis of the world in which they live. and to be able to share that analysis and to become young people who look at their education as something not for their individual development, but for development of the communities with which they identify.
Okay. And how many students participated in this program, students at the center?
Students at the center was founded by students in 1996, and I don't know exactly how many over the course of the years. Some of it fluctuates by funding. Currently, there are about 150 students across Frederick Douglass High School and McMain High School, the two places where we're still operating.
Okay. I want to turn your attention to August 29th, 2005, the date that Hurricane Katrina struck land in Louisiana. Where were you at that time, sir?
I was in New Orleans on Bayou St. John, where we gather in the spring sometimes for the Mardi Gras Indian Super Sunday parades at the American Can Company building.
Okay. And did you ride out the storm at the can, as they call it?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And how long were you there?
We arrived there. My father-in-law, who is blind, was there, and we stayed in the building. Evacuated. We were brought out by private boat when the fire department and police boats didn't pick us up. We had private guy in the neighborhood who came by boat and was picking people up and took us to high ground, where we were helicoptered to the to Causeway and Interstate 10, where we spent the night sleeping on the concrete on the side of the road, and then buses picked us up and took us to Dallas Friday morning.
How long did you stay in Dallas?
About 4 or 5 days.
And
we were partially waiting to hear word about my mother-in-law, who was in lower Ninth Ward, and we didn't know, excuse me, if she'd made it or not.
Were you able to make contact with her?
We made contact with her, I believe it was Tuesday or Wednesday, right after Labor Day, so a week and a couple of days after the storm.
Now, how long were you displaced from the city of New Orleans?
We lived in Clemson, South Carolina, and my son was in school there, and we finished his 8th grade session, so we were away till December 18th of 2005. We moved back here then.
Okay. And so you were determined to come back to New Orleans?
Yeah. And when we were in Clemson, we continued doing work. We in fact came back here and had a homecoming for our students from Douglass in early November. We continue to do planning and work for educating young people who are part of our Students at the Center program.
And so you were able to maintain contact with your students during that time?
Yes, we did. We had a meeting of our students and staff and parents in Clemson, South Carolina. We gathered from 8 different states, or about 25 of us, and we met the first weekend in October to plan. And ironically, that's the weekend we found out that the school system would not be reopened, and they gave all the schools that were going to be open to charters.
Can you elaborate on this change in the school system?
Well, I can tell you that weekend we were very depressed when we heard the news, and it dominated our conversation. The effect on those of us who are teachers, I had some conversations with the president of our organization, Brenda Mitchell, and knew that she was in conversations with the school system superintendent, and there were plans for how to reopen the schools in Algiers, and to have those of us who are teachers and agree to work in a democratic and collective way, that we would help open it together. And apparently when that agreement was going to be announced at that school board meeting in the first weekend of October, the school board took a turn on us, and 4 of the 7 members voted to turn those schools to the well, it was an organization that wasn't formed yet, from what I understand. In fact, the organization didn't have a board, and but the schools were given to some developing organization, and the school board members of themselves had to become the board of the charter schools. That was since challenged. Yeah. So the effect of that is that those of us who know the young people in New Orleans best, those of us who grew up here and owned homes here, were shut out of participating in the education of our young people.
Were public meetings held to make these decisions about what would happen with the school system?
Yeah, there were public meetings, but as sister from the St. Bernard Housing Development said, and the gentleman talking from Laguna on behalf of the homeless nations, people were not in town when those decisions were made.
Okay. And were some of the meetings also held out of town in places like Baton Rouge?
Yes, meetings were held in Baton Rouge. I think most of those meetings at the time were in Baton Rouge.
So these were public meetings with no meaningful portion of the public at least present?
I would agree, yes.
Okay. Okay. Can you paint a picture for the jurists of how schools in New Orleans are currently organized? Which entities run and operate those schools?
Well, there's a number of entities, and those entities were created after the storm and in changes of laws. So I guess the easiest way to talk about it is that in November of 2005, the state legislature passed a law that led to the state taking over any school in Orleans Parish that performed at or below the state average in terms of student test scores.
Let me interject, sir. Were these failing schools?
Not by the definition that the state was using prior to Katrina. They changed the definition. Prior to the storm, there was a system the state had in place that is actually the thing that our state is most praised for in education, which is its accountability system. It earns A grades from the Education Week report cards, and in that system, a school is given each year an evaluation of it's given a school performance score, which is based on primarily on student test scores, but also on things like attendance and dropout rates. And a school is given a score and has a growth plan that has to maintain it. It has to be working toward achieving a target growth score. In fact, the year before the storm, approximately 60% of the schools in the New Orleans public schools had met the growth targets given to them by the state, which I think probably rivals most any urban district in the nation in terms of schools meeting their growth scores. Now, there's still schools that needed to be a lot better, and those growth scores were pretty low ceilings, so it's nothing to be proud of. And about 80% of our schools had shown growth. So those rules were suspended for Orleans Parish, and now it wasn't whether you had met your growth target and were improving or not, but it was whether you met the state average or not. If that were applied to Baton Rouge, well over 50% of the schools. If that were applied to our neighboring parish, Jefferson Parish, I believe the number, and you can refer, there's a report that our union put out called No Experience Necessary that has this data in it that I hope the jurists will consult, because that's, I'm speaking partially as an individual, but I must say I'm speaking on behalf of the union in which I'm a member, and our voice comes as a collective. But about 70-some% of schools in the neighboring parish would have been taken over. But that rule was applied only to Orleans Parish.
Okay. So the state took over a number of schools, and what about the remainder?
Took over 100, I believe it was 102 of the 122 schools were taken over. So the remaining schools, they had about 17 that remained part of our local school system, which has a locally elected board, and we have an opportunity to participate with. It's dwindled to only 4 of those 17 schools that remain in New Orleans are now run by our locally elected board. The remaining, the board chartered to various private entities. And then of the schools taken over by the state, that was about 102 schools. The state is operating, again, I don't know the exact number, but the state is operating directly about 30 schools and has chartered about 25 schools. So you have schools that are chartered by the New Orleans, the local school district. You have schools that are chartered by the state of Louisiana. You have schools that had charters before the hurricane, which is a smaller number, and then you have the schools run by the local school district, and you have schools run by the state of Louisiana, Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, through an entity called the Recovery School District.
Mr. Randall, is there a single entity or agency in the city of New Orleans that provides information on how parents can gain access and enroll their children or register their children for all of these various types of schools?
There's not an entity that is, there's not an entity that's public. There's not an entity that's our government providing it. There are private entities and funding dollars that have, for instance, published booklets that, in my estimation, place parents in the role of consumers who will shop for a school rather than placing parents in the role of citizens who will help build a school in their neighborhood.
So parents have to go from one school to the next or one school district to the next to
There's
get this information?
no more do you have a basic right to attend a school that's in your neighborhood. All schools are what they call open admission, so it's where there's space and who gets there first.
Okay. I'm going to hand you a copy of a document. It's exhibit number 5. It's at tab 5 in the jurist binders. This is a report entitled Dismantling a Community. Are you familiar with this report, Mr. Randles?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And could you briefly share your understanding of that report and what it entails?
Well, it's actually a report that me and a number of my colleagues and students helped put together in partnership with the Center for Community Change out of Washington, D.C., and it's the education arm of that organization. It contains a timeline of some of the events that I talked about and others about the changes that happen in public education in New Orleans, and some of us who were on the ground in New Orleans provided some basic details, and some of them further. The timeline includes things like when the U.S. Department of Education made the decision to provide $2,000 per student to assist with reopening schools in New Orleans, but made that money available only to charter schools. So that money did not go to the local district. That money was renewed for a second year in the 2006-2007 school year. So it chronicles things like that in a timeline, and interspersed within it are narratives and analyses written by students and staff of the Students at the Center program with which I work, and includes primarily writings by students from Douglas High School and students who are graduates of McDonough 35 and Douglas High Schools.
Thank you, sir. Let's talk a little bit more about the experience of teachers. While you and your other teacher colleagues were displaced, did you continue to receive salary and benefits from the local school district in New Orleans?
The last day for which we were paid was Friday, August 26th, and we received the money for that sometime in October, I believe.
And that's Friday, August 26th of the year 2005?
Of the year 2005, that's correct.
Okay. And what was communicated to the displaced teachers by the school system?
Not much by the school system. I know the state superintendent said we should apply for unemployment or look for jobs elsewhere. And the school district communications finally came up on a website eventually.
Okay. And were displaced teachers informed when they could return to their jobs?
There was a website posting, and so I guess those of us who had access to it and looked for it. But no, we were never informed when we could return. In fact, we were informed that we were not be returning. And sometime around December of 2005, we were told that we'd be terminated in January. And there was some litigation and a stop order on that because they had violated the law about how much notice they should give before they terminate us. So the actual termination date, I believe, came in March.
Okay. And so the teachers were actually fired, is that right?
Yes, we were fired.
How many teachers were fired?
Approximately 5,000 teachers were working in the New Orleans public schools.
Okay. Now, when schools in New Orleans reopened under this new structure that you described a few minutes ago, some run by the state, some chartered, some run by the local school district, were those 5,000 teachers who were fired offered the opportunity to return to their former positions, to their former jobs?
Not to their former jobs, because their former jobs technically no longer existed because a new entity was running it. So no, we were not invited back that way. And I should say that not only were we not invited back, but the termination was somewhat brutal in the sense that if you were a teacher contemplating retirement and eligible for retirement, like my colleague Katrina in the audience, if you were fired as opposed to retiring, you would have to pay the premiums on health insurance yourself without any co-payment as part of your retirement. So essentially what happened were teachers like Katrina Rita, who was a strong teacher at Lawless High School with whom we were doing partner projects at Douglas. It's the neighboring high school. Lawless is the high school in the lower Ninth Ward, and Douglas is the high school just on the other side of the canal. You essentially had to choose to retire. So I believe the number is approximately half of our teachers retired at that point rather than be terminated. And then if you did choose to come back and teach in the New Orleans public schools again, or teach in New Orleans for the recovery school district, the rules for teaching were now different than any other teacher in the state of Louisiana. So I'm a certified teacher in the state of Louisiana. I have a master's degree in English. I have done everything but a dissertation in curriculum and instruction and college education. But for me to teach, despite having a certificate, a master's degree, tenure, 22 years of experience, I had to take a test that no other teacher in no other district in the state of Louisiana has to take.
Would you consider that a double standard?
Yes, I would consider that a double standard.
Okay.
And I would consider it an insult, as many of my colleagues think. And so a number of my colleagues who are very capable and eligible to return refused to under those conditions.
Okay. Sir, I'd like to turn your attention and the jurist's attention to exhibit number 4 at tab 4. This is a report entitled No Experience Necessary, published by the American Federation of Teachers in conjunction with other teacher unions. Sir, are you familiar with this report?
Yes, I am.
And can you briefly describe its contents?
It describes a brutal reality that I faced coming back to teach at Douglas High School, and that in comparison to my work at McMain Secondary School, and that is that the students in New Orleans after the hurricane suddenly were faced with a teaching workforce that was extremely inexperienced, and that was true especially for the schools that were part of the recovery school district.
And so was that...
So for instance, in 2006, 2007, when I began teaching again at Douglas High School, where I was teaching before the hurricane, there were 4 of my colleagues back at Douglas with whom I had taught before the storm. And we moved from a faculty that had approximately 90% of its teachers certified. We had some difficulties with getting certified teachers in mathematics, as is the case in many parts of our country right now. Moved from a school with that level of certification and experience to a school that 50% of the teachers who are my colleagues at Douglas had never taught before, were not certified to teach, and were not from New Orleans.
And so did that have an impact on the teacher's ability to connect with the students and provide high-quality education?
Yes.
Okay. And can you elaborate on that impact?
Well, number one, contrary, I just described, when I started teaching, I had a master's degree in English. I spent a semester studying under a veteran teacher as an apprentice teacher under him. I had taken courses in education and become certified prior to beginning teaching. And still the first years or 2 of teaching is a challenge. We had people suddenly who were teaching with maybe a 6-week crash course in how to teach, if they're lucky. And so it's a struggle to begin with teaching. And then you're teaching with, as I'm sure the jurists have heard, a population that's fairly traumatized. And so I've had students directly say, we need teachers who have been where we've been to bring us through this. So no fault of the people coming to town, and certainly we need help, but there's a pool of veteran teachers who were not available to us. And it had an effect on student achievement. And this report, to which you're referring, No Experience Necessary, documents in great detail and with extensive studies that have been done on particularly urban youth of color and the importance of veteran teachers, particularly to that population. And so this document talks about national, full research to that, and then applies it particularly to the situation in New Orleans. And so what is in here is very reflective of my experience as a teacher in New Orleans post-Katrina, and of my career as an educator.
Thank you, sir. Now, in addition to the difficulty in finding teachers certified in mathematics, have local schools had overall difficulty identifying teachers to meet the needs of the students who are returning?
Yes. Last spring, as is fairly well documented, maybe the jurists don't know it in the public, we had a waiting list of students who actually were not placed in schools. And part of the reason given was that there were not buildings ready, but I think as this report, No Experience Necessary, lays out in more detail than I'll do here, there was a shortage of teachers.
And there was a shortage of teachers despite the fact that there were 5,000 who had been fired and could have been contacted and asked to return.
That's correct.
Okay. Sir, I'd like to turn your attention and the jurist's attention to exhibit number 21. It's at tab 21. And for the audience's benefit, this this exhibit is an email exchange among officials with the State Department of Education and the Recovery School District, the entity charged with the task of running the majority of the publicly run schools in the city of New Orleans at this point. And, sir, in the middle of that document, on the first page of that document, there's some bolded and underlined and I believe italicized language. Mm-hmm. Could you read that aloud, please?
Do we have a real unintended consequence here because we advertised for teachers last? I see us in a real dilemma. We wanted charter schools to open and take the majority of the students. That didn't happen, and now we have the responsibility of educating the leftover children.
Thank you, sir. Now, is that email signed by a person named Glennie Lee Bouquet?
Yes, it is.
And is your understanding that that person is a member of the State Board of Elementary and Secondary
She's an
Education?
elected representative from the 3rd District of the State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education.
Now, sir, you obviously did not write the email, and I'm not sure that Ms. Bouquet shared to whom she was referring, but would you consider those children who are leftover children the average run-of-the-mill students in New Orleans?
You know, the problems we have that, are coming after Katrina aren't new problems. We've for a long time had what my students described in writings they did on the 50th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision to which you referred. We've had very separate and unequal schools in this city, and largely by having some schools select their students and other schools not select their students. Prior to the storm, I'm a high school teacher, so I know secondary education. Prior to the storm, 1/3 of our public high schools in New Orleans selected their students. Those students who did not get into those schools because they didn't pass a particular test, those students who did not get into those schools because their parents didn't stand in line for them or lobby for them, were in our neighborhood schools. Many of us gladly teach in those settings, and we're helping develop them. After the storm, the competition for students as a resource has increased tremendously, and I would say the gap between which students are educated in which settings and which students have which resources has widened significantly.
So you would say, or would you agree rather, sir, that the level of social stratification among schools in the city of New Orleans has increased and intensified since Hurricane Katrina?
I would say yes.
Okay. I have no further questions for the witness. Do the jurists have any questions? It will be translated, so we need you to sit for a second.
Esse relato, último relato da falta de experiência de professores.
When you speak about the lack of experience of the teachers,
A seleção de escolas com melhores verbas, com melhor desempenho, fica nítido.
it's clear that there's a selection here through the process of schools with more funding.
Que daqui a alguns meses, a periferia, ou seja, os bairros da comunidade negra, vai a cada dia mais ficando discriminado, com melhor qualidade de ensino, com resultado de pior desempenho.
So it's clear from what you're saying that this stratification is increasing as the most of the school children are forced into poor schools.
Futuros estudantes sem condições de melhoria de profissionalismo.
But this also means fewer opportunities for these students to move on to professional life.
Que futuramente pode ser operários ou seres humanos de terceira categoria por culpa do próprio Estado.
Third-rate production line workers or just untrained people because of the lack of responsibility and follow-up by the state.
Precisamos urgentemente levar essa má notícia para o resto do mundo. Isto é absurdo.
This is absurd. This is unacceptable. We have to take this information here to all corners of the world, throughout the world.
Madam Chief Jurist, some other jurists had questions. If you would preside and recognize them and do whatever you want to speak. Thank you.
Yes.
¿Considera usted que el ciclón Katrina ha sido el pretexto para aplicar planes que los gobiernos federal, estatal, local tenían ya preparados para destruir la educación tal como usted la describe?
Do you believe that Hurricane Katrina gave the state, federal, local governments the opportunity to carry forth on plans that they already had in the works to destroy unions and destroy public education?
The short answer is, well, it's a complicated thing. Certainly, the storm facilitated that, and there was certainly a number of people who had a desire in the private sector as well as the public sector to destroy the union. It was, again, a force in the city and in the nation. So yes, but many interests came about. For instance, there's one of the glaring examples, and for me that is problematic as anything, is that it allowed certain private citizens and private foundations who had designs on certain prime real estate in terms of buildings in the public schools to take over those buildings. So for instance, Forshey High School, which was one of the few schools in the city that did not take water, was not reopened as a school for the children who went to that high school before the hurricane. It was reopened for a high school that was created after the hurricane, a high school that had been requested by certain powerful interests in town, including a parent, for instance, who works for the Ford Foundation in terms of channeling how money flows here from those foundations. That elementary and middle school was converted to a high school after the hurricane, when it had been voted down when the citizens were in town before the hurricane. That school had as its admission requirements prior attendance at the school, child of a university professor. It opened to young people in the city and opened as a 9th grade only high school. And so this 4-story high school that could have housed many of our young people was housing only the 9th grade and then the 7th and 8th graders from the middle school, further exacerbating some social problems after the storm, because you had the young people who were from that part of town suddenly having to go to another part of the city to attend high school. And so you ended up, having some teachers and students doing some valiant and good work and learning how to be together when they were from different areas of the city. And I think the students and teachers succeeded at that well. But those who have money and resources and those who make policy decisions failed what our State Board of Education person called the leftover young people of the city. And I give that long narrative because to agree with you that before the storm, people were attempting some of these things and doing it unsuccessfully because our citizens were here. After the storm, when we were not here, that changed. The mayor appointed a commission on education to bring back education to the city. The teacher representative on it was an organization called Teach for America, not an organization called United Teachers of New Orleans that represented 85% of the teachers in the city. We did not have representation on that committee. 3 principals on it, all 3 principals of charter schools now, including principal of the school that took over the Forche building.
My brother?
Oui. Le fait que l'enseignant soit formé très rapidement aujourd'hui, donc enseigne sans expérience.
The fact that teachers are trained so quickly and forced into this without any experience, or put into this situation without experience.
Que les écoles soient privatisées.
And that schools are privatized.
Vous comme enseignant expérimenté, que pensez-vous où c'est que ça va aboutir pour les enfants, c'est-à-dire pour la génération d'adultes de demain?
What do you, as an experienced teacher, think about what this warns or points to for those students and for tomorrow's generation?
Et que faudrait-il faire d'après vous? Et puis qui doit prendre cette responsabilité?
What do you think can be done to turn this situation around, and who are those responsible here for this situation?
The situation we face is a situation of our whole community, government, private sector, everyone. I think that